Hi everyone, welcome one more time to the episode of Ultrax Podcast Talks, Football Talks 101. My name is Marko Matušinskij, and today with us I have one special guest. I would like to say welcome and thank you, JB Morin, that you are here today with me and with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, as you already know, all of our listeners, that JP, you are a leading expert here in sports science and especially in sprinting mechanics, resistance sprinting training, and force velocity profiling. These are some of the topics that we will cover. But I don't want to say, well, all of us know who you are, but I don't want to say something, on my own. So I think that it's good that you say something a little bit more about yourself for our listeners.
Yeah, so I live and I work in France, in Saint-Étienne. It's in the center of France, close to Lyon. I'm a full professor at the university, and so I'm doing research and I am teaching in sports science, and I'm also the director of the sports science department. My background is a master's in sports science and training, and a PhD in medicine around locomotion biomechanics. And I have also a background in sports as an athlete myself. So, football player initially, and then track and field competitor and coach. And then I did a bit of physical preparation in many sports where running and sprinting is involved. And I am still doing consultancy and training today with some athletes or consultancy with clubs around this topic that is my consistent topic over the years, sprinting and sprint training.
It sounds like a great combination, of everything, research, teaching, also working with athletes and teams. And I like definitely the part that you also was an athlete as a football player and also in track and field. And I remember our talk. I don't know, do you remember in back in Spain before 2 years at the FSI conference? We talked a little bit about that. And but to get back here, you mentioned biomechanics and sprinting. That is your topic of interest. And what drives your passion into these areas? Why you choose this particular topic?
It's interesting because when I was a football player, I was in high school and not at the university, and I went to do track and field and middle distance and long sprint at the faculty. And then I started questioning my own practice. Why am I running slow? Why am I improving myself? What type of training is efficient for me? What type of training is not? What do I like? What do I dislike? And then questioning my own practice became questioning the practice in general. And this is the research process. So that might be a bit biased, a bit influenced because you have your own bias, but that might be also a good way to uh, put the time and energy, because when you're passionate about something, because it's your own practice, you like to spend time. It's not working. It's like, knowing more and experimenting. So that was the starting point.
Yeah, experimenting on yourself is always interesting. I can relate when I started to work, when you are at the university and you are learning there, you are reading stuff. But when I first stand on a pitch as a coach, and when I checked why am I doing this number of sets and these exercises, then you get a lot of questions. Uh,
Mhm.
to start with the first topic of our talk, maybe to go to the force velocity profiling in sprinting. And as you said, this is something that you teach all over the year. So can you tell us more about the whole concept and what do you think that this kind of concept have the significance in optimizing sprint performance and performance in athletes?
Yeah. So it's very simple. Um, it's a way to explain sprint performance, because when you have an athlete that is fast or slow, if you just time the athletes, then you know very little. You know if their performance is good or not, but you don't know where this comes from. And so the idea is to study the mechanics that generate acceleration, speed, and performance, and then to identify some factors, mechanical factors, that we can improve. Because there is something that I always start all my courses, my teaching with that. Almost everyone can get faster. It means we can improve speed and sprint performance in almost everybody on Earth, except the final top level athletes where there is no margin of improvements. But if you take any football player, there is always something we can do. And the mechanics, and so the force output and the force velocity profile is one way to understand the mechanics. The mechanics is a way to say, okay, where does the performance come from and where is the potential margin of improvement? You see? So that's the main reason why we go one step beyond in the analysis.
Yeah, it's not just the results, it's what builds this result. And I liked what you said about that we can do everyone faster, because here in Croatia and in Balkan countries you still have some thinking, and that from the coaches, that if you missed some age when you should work on speed, or if you are slow, that it's hard to change this kind of mechanics. But I'm totally agree with this part. So we can we can improve this. And when you are building training sessions, how do you approach to designing training programs based on individuals' force velocity profile?
So it's really, really, really dependent on the context. What is the context? How much time do I have to work with the athletes? What is their football training context? What can I do? The story is always the same. It's what can I do, and what do the athlete or the coaches want? Because very often people don't really want the athletes to get faster, because if they did, they would allow some time, they would allow some training adaptation if this was a big rock, like a priority. If this is not a priority, then there is no time allocated and everything. So the first thing is to say, okay, what is the context? What is my margin of action? So, because then if this is very small or this is very large, the content of the training is totally different. So it's very often the first question I ask, because the first question is, do you want to get faster? Well, most of the time it's yes. I never heard someone who said, no, I don't care.
Yeah.
And then
That's
if the answer
sure.
is yes, it's what does that yes mean? If no, we don't have time, then that's the end of discussion.
That's it.
And then we try to negotiate. And honestly, in my experience, I would say that for a standard football player, even at the pro level, I would say that the minimum you need is 2 times 30 minutes to 1 hour a week. If you don't have 2 times 30 minutes per week on average, then no big surprise. There is almost nothing. There is no magic stick. 2 times 30 minutes. I would say it's the minimum. There is no research on that because it's impossible to do this type of research. But in my experience, if you work well, 2 times 30 minutes per week, specifically on speed, then you might get some results after some weeks of work. But that's if you're not able to have that minimum, no way you can build a program. No way.
Yeah, and as you said, it depends on the context and on the individual, and to get individual results. Now we connect with football and the preseason that is coming. When someone wants to check this profile before it's starting with the training, what do you recommend when it comes to testing? We saw a lot of different approaches to testing speed with the timing gates, with the GPS devices. And if you should say for the coach that is starting with the team now in the preseason, what will be your recommendation for him?
You mean before testing, or in order to do testing?
Just like what kind of testing procedure to select to use in your preseason or before that in off season.
Yeah. So that's the point. This is very interesting. We are able to recalculate the main mechanics from a simple sprint test. That is a sprint that's a linear sprint until maximum speed, which means for most football players 30 meters. So I would say that we can get some individualized information from a test that is not different from a simple 30-meter test. So again, same answer as before. If the answer, can we do that test, is no, then okay, no problem. You will get no data about the mechanics. If the answer is yes, we can do a 30-meter sprint test because we want to have the split times, let's say, then we will say we just need something to measure the velocity and we will calculate everything else, or we will estimate everything else. So there is no extra cost in terms of effort and in terms of input.
When it comes to sprinting on 30 meters, linear sprint, as you said, what is your thought about how many timing gates or how many points we should have? Like, should we check only 5, 10 meters, 20 meters, or maybe just at the end of the 30-meter run?
Yeah. So this is very important because if you want to calculate the main mechanics and the force output, the propulsive force output, everything, you have two solutions. You have the running velocity, instantaneous or at a high sampling frequency, like with a radar, with a GPS, with a velocimeter device. And if you don't have that, you need split times. And if you use split times, you need at least 4 splits over the acceleration. So there's been some studies showing that if you have less information than 5, 10, 20, 30, the calculations will be wrong. And so you need at least 4 split times. So if you can have that, you can recalculate everything.
Perfect. Because it's always is here, I know with the clubs and when we are discussing about it, it's always about should we test 5, 10, or should we test just 20, 30 meters? So I think this is good for listeners to hear. And also, as we are talking about testing, just one more thing before I start with the other topic. When it comes to testing, maybe female or male players in football and youth players, have you noticed some differences, in the like what is happening with their variables over 30 meters run?
No big difference. The only difference is that younger players, slower players, and women, on average, have a shorter distance to reach top speed. That's the only main difference. But you will find some young players with a top speed around 25 meters. You will find some elite women with a top speed around 25 meters. And so I would say that the same rule applies to everybody. We need the entire acceleration to be recorded. So if this is only 20 meters, like with very young kids, or we have that often in rugby, in elite rugby players with like 150 kilos, we don't do a 30-meter test, we do a 20-meter test.
20 meters.
So there's no basic difference between age or sex, except that maybe there is an extra distance that we don't need in testing. But if you have super fast women or super fast kids, then maintain the 30 meters because you don't want to miss the information.
Something, yeah.
Yes.
So it's quite individual, and it depends on the context, as you said, also here in this question.
Yeah.
You mentioned before the GPS testing, and we know a lot of, people who are following your work know about the papers on in situ testing with GPSs, about profiling, and you have a lot of videos and exciting materials on GPX page about their work. So what can you tell us, and can you tell us more about this GPS in situ profiling and defining sprinting mechanics, how this can help coaches in their work?
Yeah. So the things that we discussed before are related to the linear sprint acceleration capability. And then we had some discussions with football coaches where they said, look, we don't have the time and we don't really want to expose the players to this type of efforts. And at the same time, we are collecting data during the entire training sessions, games, and during these games, the players actually accelerate a lot and they produce short sprints, intermediate distance sprints, long sprints, and can we find something there? And the idea is very simple. If you build a cloud of data and you plot on the same plot the speed and the acceleration, that is the running speed at every moment on the pitch, slow to maximum, and the corresponding acceleration, you will have a cloud of points. And if you take the positive accelerations, you will have the maximum values of acceleration for every speed. Like when I run at 2 meters per second, what was my maximum acceleration during the game? When I run at 3, at 4, at 5, at 6. And when you plot the maximum acceleration possible at every speed, you have a linear regression line. And there has been some works after our first work on that in 2019, showing it was consistent in football players. We need at least 2 to 3 sessions or games data to have something, solid. And you have an idea of the acceleration speed profile that is playing football, not on a specific test. So it's 2 different types of information. But the second one, the in situ one, gives you an idea of the player's production in the real football context. And it's funny because I discussed that with Martin Buchheit in a podcast. It's a good thing and a limitation at the same time. It's a good thing because it tells us the real status of the player. And the limitation is that we don't really know what is explaining this status. It can be the tactics of the coach. It can be many, many variables, and we don't know exactly what is explaining the profile.
So you mentioned in before when we discussed about GPS and in situ testing, and I think like you said that it's quite practical. And can you tell us more about it and what are the principles and how does it function?
Yeah, so the idea is that when you do a linear sprint acceleration, you cover your entire speed spectrum in 5 or 6 seconds, from low speed to high speed, from high acceleration to low acceleration. Now, sometimes in football, we don't want or we cannot test this in the players. And at the same time, we collect a lot of game data or training data. And during a game or during a training session, when you run all over the pitch, you also cover your speed spectrum at different time points from low speed to maximum speed. And you also cover your acceleration spectrum from high acceleration to low acceleration. But because it's during different times and during 2 or 3 hour sessions or games, if we collect the entire data and we plot running speed as a function of the acceleration, we can find for every speed of your spectrum from low to maximum, your maximum acceleration that you produce at that speed. And when we do that, we have an idea of what we call the in situ acceleration speed profile. So conceptually, it's the same as your propulsive force velocity profile, but it's during a real game or it's during real football. So there is no testing. So I discussed that with Martin Buchheit. This is at the same time a very good point and a big limitation. It's a very good point because I know your physical status in football, very specific to football, without doing a linear sprint test. But there is so many things that can influence your in situ profile, the tactics of the coach, the opponents, your shape on that day, anything that sometimes the information is too macroscopic. But I can tell you that some clubs are doing some regular testing because they try to connect this in situ profile to the training pattern, to the fatigue of the player, to the instructions of the coach, and so on.
Yeah, but it's also not time consuming, as you said. You are using the GPS data, and you can do something with that. And have you noticed with now the connections that you said, if the player is fatigued, the the profile is changing. If you're in rehabilitation, the profile is changing. Have you noticed, or is there any research that you also check what is happening with the profile from week to week or from period to period, like pre-season, in season?
So there has been a couple of research on that, but in as far as I remember, there's not many research on a regular monitoring of that profile. Some clubs, not only in soccer, in football, but also in rugby or in other sports, some clubs are doing some monitoring, but they are not publishing data because they want to get the information for themselves, and
For themselves, yeah.
that could be interesting. I know that there is some studies in rugby for the preseason to season data, and I work with some clubs for this, but not with a publication objective.
Yeah, it could be quite interesting to see what is happening with acceleration velocity profile over the weeks, with the in season, or maybe also to check what is happening with this profile with the substitutes and the players who are
Yeah,
playing all the time, because these are the things that are always under the question with the teams in football. So yeah,
yeah.
it could be interesting. Uh, well, you have a wide spectrum of topics. I put here some notes also, and I would like to go to well, it's also sprinting, but sprinting with a little bit of resistance. And I know that you are also here in this topic quite you went quite deep in it. And can you tell us more about your insight into programming resistance sprints? How do you approach to it, and what kind of data points and variables do you check here?
Yeah. So the basic idea is very simple. When you do some gym work, squat, press, and so on, your objective is to overload your system in a movement to make this movement more powerful or with more strength. Our idea is to say we are going to apply the same philosophy to the running, to the sprinting pattern. So the idea is, instead of loading your squat movement, I'm going to bring an overload to your sprint movement. The idea is, if you develop more force or more power because of this overload, the adaptation will be that you will eventually sprint with more force or more power. Now, in 2016, we did a review of literature, and we saw that the training studies so far used only pretty light loads. 40% of body mass was the record in the entire literature. And at the same time, we know that some coaches in many sports like American football, even track and field, used heavier loads. Because the idea is that if you want to improve force, you need an overload. Let me give you an example at the squat. There is no way you will improve your squat 1 RM by doing some jump squats with a light bar. Everyone agrees with that. If you want to increase your 1 RM, you will need some loads. So the idea here is to say, what do we want to improve, and to adapt the load to that objective. So, for example, if I want to improve my high speed and my force capability at high speed, then the
Yeah.
most specific load I can find is a pretty light load, because I want to run fast. That's what I call velocity-based training applied to running. So
Running, yeah.
it's not the load that dictates the decision. It's the objective. What part of the spectrum do you want to improve? Because of your context, I work a lot with tennis players in France. In
Yeah.
tennis, you need to be good at starting sprints for 5-10 meters maximum, or changing direction, which is roughly the same in terms of acceleration. And so you need to work on the high force, low velocity part of the spectrum. That's the idea. And you can only do that with resistance, because the
Yeah.
problem is, if you start a sprint without resistance, in 1 second, you will already be at 50% of your maximum speed.
Maximum.
And these are numbers. We cannot disagree with that. So it means that if you don't use resistance and you sprint for more than 1 second, you're already too fast and you're not stimulating your acceleration anymore. You see the idea?
Yeah. Yeah, I get the idea. It's quite simply explained about the idea of the resistance sprinting. And when it comes to, let's say, programming of resistance sprinting in a weekly cycle in football, so let's say that we have a pattern of the preseason is starting and we have one game per week. So how often you think and should we do this type of work? Because it's always is, we have resistance sprinting, multi-directional speed trainings, high velocity work, uphills, so when to put this kind of work into our daily or weekly structure?
Yeah. So mechanically speaking, you can consider uphill sprinting as a form of resistance sprinting. The idea is very simple to me, and some clubs are doing that. The idea is that you will have to microdose this, and I would say that 2 or 3 repetitions twice a week is enough to at least maintain the data, power, maximum force, and so on. And so you can have this at the end of a physical prep session, at the end of a speed-oriented session. I know some clubs who are doing 2 or 3 reps with an intermediate load for 5 or 10 meters, 2 times per week only. So because there's no way you can do like a track session of 2 hours and everything. It's not realistic.
Yeah.
But because you cannot do that, it doesn't mean you cannot microdose and do a couple of reps at the end of a warm-up, at the end of a session. If the players are ready to sprint with a load, you can do microdosing. Some clubs also do that 2 or 3 days before the game in order to have a kind of short-term maximum power adaptation. And this allows you to program that during the entire game season. Of course, the big objective will be the preseason, the off-season in some sports where you have a long off-season period, the winter break, for example, and so on.
That's it.
Yeah.
And when we connect this resistance sprinting with horizontal sprinting without the weights, can we combine these two methods in a weekly structure, like in weekly structure in football? Let's say we are in season and we want to work on our speed, but also resistance sprinting. How will you approach to this topic?
Yeah. So in my experience and my approach and also my discussions with physical prep and coaches, I think it's not very efficient to mix them within the same session. But you can have like a high acceleration day with some loads. That is, for example, game day -4, and a high speed day. That is, for example, game day -2. And in both cases, you don't want to go with too many reps. Because there's many other things, and you don't want to overstimulate the system. So I would say that doing 2 to 4 reps on the high power day or the high force day, and 2 to 4 reps on the high speed day might be something, a good compromise. It's not ideal, but the objective is not to make them sprinters. The objective is to make them faster as football players. So football will always be the priority.
Yeah, and to stimulate them with this kind of work, not to miss it. We just want to have this during our weekly cycle. And the last question before we wrap everything up is about, we mentioned them already, it's about substitute players. And they always miss some kind of, and when you check the literature, they usually miss this high speed work and sprinting work. And it's always a question when to do this high velocity work with them, because we are doing a tapper for all of our team on a game day. but they miss sometimes this high velocity work. So how do you approach to substitutes and players who don't play or don't travel with the team?
So there's two different substitute players. Some players will not play. It means they don't travel, they are not here on the bench on game day. With those players, you definitely need to replace the sprint demand of the game. So one way to approach things is to take the average acceleration numbers and the average high speed numbers of the team or the players of the same positions, and to do, it's not a very funny session, but you can bring some balls and you can make it a football session, but to do the equivalent at least of half of a game. Then the tricky point is the players who are on the bench, so they cannot do that on taper day. They obviously cannot do that during the game because maybe they will play. And here, the objective is to, if the context allows you, to have this very, very fast after the game. So either you can do it, it's a home game, and you can do it on your own pitch. And I saw that, for example, in Monaco, they do some sprints after the game. Or if it's away, you can try to have that happen on game day +1 as soon as you come back, because the worst scenario would be they don't do that during the taper because maybe they will play. It turns out that they actually don't play, and then you do nothing afterwards. In these players, there is a high risk of, a long period without exposure, and then from a performance perspective, they missed a stimulus that the other ones had. And from an injury prevention perspective, they also maybe had a period with a low stimulus before some coming periods with a high stimulus.
Yeah, that's it. Their chronic load is not matched with the players who play constantly, 11 against 11, and with the official games. And it's something that it's quite often also here, in this league when we are competing, that you can see that some compensation training sessions can be quite similar, with some short intervals, but it's good. We are covering high speeds, but we are missing maybe this big gap. And imagine if you do this 2 or 3 times a week, you have 1 month of missing this kind of work. So
I always say that the compensation session very often is matching the demands from an energetic perspective, but not from a mechanical perspective in terms of very high force, acceleration, and very high speed.
Yeah, that's it with my questions. And JB, thank you so much for your time and sharing the experience. As you already know, we will have an event soon with you on the 3rd of February. So this was a short introduction for all the listeners who want to participate. We cover a lot of interesting topics, from defining sprinting profiles, how to test them, how to implement resistance sprinting and sprinting in periodization cycle. And we will cover all of these topics more in the upcoming webinar. So from my side, thank you one more time for spending time with me and with us. And I hope that we will talk even more often like this.
Excellent. My pleasure. Bye-bye.